A nationally and internationally recognized legal scholar, she's an expert on race and justice. Her research was pivotal in the movement that ended Louisiana's use of non-unanimous juries in 2018. And she co-founded the advocacy team that secured this historic reform. Professor Bell has contributed to several landmark advocacy campaigns, including the England 3 case, Vincent Simmons case, and the posthumous pardon of Homer Plessy, which, as law students, we all know is the famous case of Plessy v. Ferguson, where she was selected as a historian for the occasion. She's also the author of a 3-book series beginning with the Under Indictment, Race, Juries, and Justice in Louisiana. She is a sought-after active scholar. Professor Bell has appeared on platforms such as MSNBC, NPR, and international platforms such as La Presse, which is French for the press. The French are not credited. Her work has been quoted in publications such as the Washington Post and the New Yorker. She has twice submitted testimony to the U.S. Senate Judicial Committee and collaborated on local, national, and international racial justice initiatives. Her honors include membership in the National Black Lawyers Top 100, recognition by CIO Views magazine as one of the top 10 influential leaders making an impact in the legal industry, and numerous community accolades such as the National Civil Rights Conference Civil Rights and Social Justice Award. The Louisiana legislature has commended her for her scholarly achievements, recognizing the pride and honor she brings to the state. Guided by Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 1's call to seek justice, Professor Bell remains unwavering in her commitment to dismantling racial hierarchies and combating injustice. And personally, it is my honor to welcome her because I had the pleasure of meeting her in Baton Rouge a couple months ago, and just listening to her speak sparked something in me that I didn't even know was in me. Professor Bell is insightful, she is important, and I ask that you please lend your ears to her today and listen to her, especially in the times that we're living in today. So without further ado, please join me in standing up and welcome your keynote speaker, Professor Bell.
That it ended in the late 1960s. And so when you listen to that lecture, you will begin to think that by the 70s, civil rights had been achieved in this country. And that's because we got very major pieces of civil rights legislation in the 60s. For example, we got the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prevents employment discrimination. We also got the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prevents the use of literacy tests. And it also gives the federal government powers to oversee any type of voting irregularities in this country. And then here comes, in 1968, the Civil Rights Act that we know now as the Fair Housing Act, which also prohibits discrimination We believe that it was really in our rearview mirror. We have some optimistic things happening in 1970 that would encourage this belief. We see the University of California Regents versus Bakke decision. In that decision, we know the Supreme Court ruled that affirmative action could be used as a legal strategy to deal with past discrimination. Bakke allowed for race to be one of several determining factors in admissions policies for college. And then there's some noteworthy victories also on the criminal side. We see in the 70s, members of Louisiana's Black Panther Party standing trial. The police shot into their headquarters and then charged them with attempted murder of those police officers. They had a black attorney whose name is Ernest Jones. He was a graduate of Howard Law. He takes those Panthers to trial in New Orleans, and that jury in New Orleans found each one of those Panthers not guilty of killing or shooting at any of those police officers that day. That same year, 1970, we have 13 New York Black Panthers on trial. Same allegation that they shot at police. The trial is an 8-month trial. And guess what happens at the end of 8 months? The jury has acquitted those Black Panthers of 156 serious charges against law enforcement. So we have reason in the 70s to be optimistic. We have in the 70s these great strides when it comes to politics, home ownership, business, education for blacks. We see Dr. Clifton Wharton with his appointment as the president of Michigan State University. He's the first African American to become the head of a predominantly white university in the 20th century. Later in 1970, Earl Graves Sr. publishes the first issue of Black Enterprise, a magazine that's still in existence today. It is providing essential business information and advice. In the 70s, we also get the Congressional Black Caucus. We have Shirley Chisholm, who is becoming the first black person to campaign for a Democratic presidential nomination. And then there is the music of the 70s. That music reflects the great anticipation of the hour. John Lennon's song, Imagine. It is the top of the charts in the 1970s. In that song, Lennon is saying to us these ideals of a future free of division, a future free of violence, future free of borders, people existing in peace, John Lennon sings about, and he talks about this brotherhood of mankind. At the same time that these things are taking place, there is the Heritage Foundation, and they too are doing some imagining. The Heritage Foundation brands itself as a conservative think tank. I train my law students that the most important lessons in law are the ones that are not said. The lessons that are not written in any books, those are the ones that I train my law students to look for. And what is not said about the Heritage Foundation is that they falsely claim that abstinence education programs are effective. They express contempt for members of the LGBT community and members who are people of color and women and anybody who is low income. They are opposed to abortions and reproductive rights. And while black lawyers were embracing that definition of civil rights, and embracing that date of civil rights, and black Americans were getting comfortable believing that we had entered this post-racial era, the Heritage Foundation was strategizing. And their strategy became the blueprint for the Reagan Revolution. Now you may be wondering, how could they have accomplished that? They used task forces of volunteers. And those volunteers weren't just anybody. They were folks with specific expertise in policy. They knew how to During his first term, Donald Trump implemented 64% of their desires. The Heritage Foundation was so inspired by that by 2025, they have produced a 922-page presidential transition project. And guess what? They had it ready for Donald Trump when he assumed office on the first day. I want you to hear one of the things that 2025 report says, and I'm quoting. The Heritage Foundation asked the new president to restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and to protect children. And their mandate continues, and I quote, "The next conservative president must make the institutions of America, civil society, hard targets on any woke culture warrior. This starts with deleting the term sexual orientation, gender identity, diversity, equity, inclusion, gender awareness, gender sensitivity, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights." And so here we see on January the 20th, 2025, Trump takes office, and guess what he does? He issues an executive order that refers to diversity, equity, and inclusion as programs of forced, illegal, and immoral discrimination. The order that he issued terminates all of these programs in the federal government. But that was not enough for Donald Trump and the Heritage Foundation. With the simple stroke of a pen, Donald Trump signed executive orders to prosecute now, on the state level, people who the federal death sentences have been commuted by Joe Biden. The executive orders now also seek to end that federal affirmative action that I mentioned to you earlier. It frames migrants as national security threats for one reason, so that constitutional protections now can be sidestepped. It withholds government funds from any state that declares itself a sanctuary city. And then he signs this order that says for a building now to have to be constructed, all of the architectural designs have to be blessed now by one man named Donald Trump, if they are federal buildings. Now, if I were your run-of-the-mill speaker, this would be the point in my remarks where I would say to you that Donald Trump is the Antichrist. And this is where I would tell you that conservatives were the bane of our existence. But I am not her, and that is not why I braved the snow and the inclement weather to be here tonight. The role of the black lawyer in the fight for freedom is why I'm here, and that is what I wish to talk to you about. Now, I want to start the conversation back in 1958 with some very, very important words that Dr. Martin Luther King said to us, and I quote, "If the migrants of the white South fail to act now, history will have to record the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. Our generation will have to repent, not only for the acts and words of the children of darkness, but also for the fears and apathy of the children of light. So no, I will not use my time indicting the conservatives for honoring their calling. Rather, I ask of the black lawyer, are we honoring ours? I ask of all the prospective black lawyers in the room, do you have a social justice calling? Do you intend to honor that social justice calling? More importantly, are you prepared at this moment to do that work? As we consider the role of the black lawyer in the fight for freedom, we must understand the urgency of becoming policy warriors at this hour. In my third book, The Summons, I distinguished policy from law, and I want to quote just a little from that book. I say to the readers, laws are rules that regulate the actions of people in a jurisdiction. violating policy. The beliefs and the attitudes that shape policy are often the inspiration for laws. And conversely, laws can cause policy creation in an effort to carry the law out. And so this book goes on to share an example to teach my students exactly what I mean by this thing called policy. The example the book uses is about the ducks. We have speeders who are regularly crossing the streets, and they are speeding in a way that might harm these ducks. And so we need a policy to address this problem. So the policy we devise is that we're going to install speed bumps at the duck crossings. As law, we decide that now that we have these speed bumps in the duck crossings, we will also implement some criminal sanctions for those who violate the speeding expectation. You see, policy is really what becomes priority in a jurisdiction. Policy inspires the law because of the potential it has for being much more expeditious as a pathway to making changes. And so the first role of Black lawyers in this fight for freedom is to understand the importance of policy and to appreciate how to implement it, how to change it, and also to know that it is much more prudent to start any social change at policy because of the way policy gives birth ultimately to law. By the time a law is written, it is usually way too late to reverse the trend. The Heritage Foundation capitalized on this, and that is exactly why we are seeing at this moment the seeds that they planted back in the 70s while we were basking in the sun. Another role of the Black lawyer in the fight for freedom is to conceptualize a meaning of freedom and to create a blueprint for people to achieve it. You see, in 1865, when chattel slavery ended, the government actually confused release with freedom. Releasing folks off of plantations is not freedom. As I see it, freedom is the power to determine actions without restraint. Freedom is the exemption from any external control or regulation. When we have more people of color in custody at this moment and under state supervision than we did during chattel slavery, we are not free. When we have people of color disproportionately subject to police stops and brutality, we are not free. Freedom is a fragile thing, people. It is never more than one generation away from extinction. It is ours by way of inheritance, don't believe. It must be fought for, it must be defended, and it must be a constant struggle by every single generation. Black lawyers, this is a case that you must accept, this case about our definition of freedom. My bio, as you heard, mentions me spending years fighting this thing called non-unanimous juries. As I did that work, I became better acquainted with the science of jury deliberations. And much of what I learned during that campaign to end that tragic violation of the Sixth Amendment speaks directly to tonight's topic. And so I say in my first book, Under Indictment, and I quote, "One underestimates the jury by describing it as a simple gathering of people who decide the outcome of a case. A jury is a term of art. A jury is an institution. It is sacred and it is multifaceted. To reach an accurate and a reliable result, a jury must be diverse. And there is a reason why. Diversity tends to slow deliberations down, causes discussions to be richer. The science also teaches us that when we have people of color in that deliberation room, there is often the reasonable doubt that is raised by those people of color. So you may ask, why are you discussing this stuff? Professor Bell, your work with non-unanimous juries is over, and I agree, I'm not confused tonight. There's a reason that I decided to share this tonight, and it is because Black lawyers have a lifetime experience. Black lawyers have generational experience about what it means to be excluded by institutions and systems and to be silenced by structures. We have a very unique view of the legal system. It is black lawyers who are to the black community what a black juror is to a person on trial. And if the laws and the justice system continue to be shaped by few, they will serve only few and be respected only by a few. Black lawyers are critical to constructing a justice system that serves all the people, which means we have a duty to accept causes and cases that might result in personal backlash. I speak this thinking right now of the Gina 6 case. It is because of the type of dislawyering that I described that my dear friend Theo Shaw escaped the prison cell that they prepared for him. He is now a lawyer because of the lawyering that I speak of. We have a duty, black lawyers, to raise challenges to laws, to customs, to policies, to practices that might result in us being ostracized. I say this thinking right now of Justice Bernadette Johnson. At the time of George Floyd's murder, she was at the Supreme Court of Louisiana, the Chief Justice at the hour. She seized the opportunity to send an open letter. And in that open letter to the entire judiciary, she says, and I quote, "We are part of the problem that they protest about." She goes on to say in that letter, "I admit to you very readily that our justice system falls short of the ideals that it espouses." Justice Johnson says also with courage that I call each of you to action. Every judge, every lawyer, every legislator, every law enforcement official. She implored each of them to understand that they played a role in the problem that the people were protesting. And she reminded them that laws are never the same as justice. Black lawyers have a duty to confront every person and every system whose actions are detrimental to people in particular and harmful to human beings in general. I speak of this thinking of a description that I wrote in my book, The Summons. And this is a quote of me summarizing what I believe the Louisiana criminal justice system is. I say Louisiana's legal system operates much like a legal assembly line, where production is swift, it is ritualistic, it is void of any personal quest for truth, any notion of justice or fair play or respect for the sanctity of life. I say that that justice system gives to people of color as also to people of poor and people of no means the same. The same by class, the same by color, the same by creed. And so at this moment, it is not notable to see a poor white person or a poor person of color crushed by the scales of justice in Louisiana. That is no longer remarkable. Black lawyers, you must also teach people of color that they harm people of color when they avoid jury service in this country. As black lawyers, we must be comfortable doing the uncomfortable. We cannot be the juror who sits silently in the juror box. We must be the foreperson on that jury, and we must be skilled at the art of persuasion. Now, if you listened to me a little bit earlier with a discerning ear, you would remember me mentioning to you that when we saw this progress in the 70s, we also saw a counter response by the conservatives. Well, what I want to be sure that I do not do tonight is focus on what they did do. I want to focus instead on what they did not do. They did not wallow in hopelessness. They did not wait on some other person to do it for them. They accepted the responsibility for what they wanted changed in this country. They put all their egos and all of their personal grievances aside, and they organized, and they worked tirelessly. They volunteered, they worked sacrificially to achieve what they had adopted as their meaning of freedom. And there is a hidden message here for us. Black lawyers, we have been knowing law since 1844, when Macon Boiling Allen became barred in Maine. This was our first black lawyer, and this is way before the Civil War. black problems, to working for government, to working for big law, for working in law schools and the judiciary and the executive branch. And if you're not careful, you could hear all of this and conclude that we have obviously come forward. But I'm here to tell you that I disagree. According to the American Bar Association, the number of black lawyers has not changed in the past decade. Black lawyers were 5% of the profession in 2014, and in 2024, we were still 5% of the profession. At the same time, white lawyers were 86% of the profession. So what that really means now is in 2025, we are still working on a foundation for this house. The black community needs for black lawyers has outpaced the production of black lawyers. Translation, black communities are vulnerable and they are perpetually underserved. And you can't even trust the idea that we have 5% at work. That is not guaranteed. And it's going to get worse now in this political climate, the need of this hour. Is it possible that somebody considered this before we had this conversation tonight? Is it possible that that person realized that if we had enough lawyers, we would be in a better position to fight back? Is it possible that someone thought of that when they ended affirmative action in admissions to law schools? Was the implementation of these standardized tests that came about only after black folks started becoming lawyers, was that happenstance? I say not at all, because these are the things that policy has been used, of course, to reduce the roster of capable black players. See, they knew the game against a team could never be won without teammates. So let's be clear about something. The situation at this hour is even worse because we don't really know, as I said, that we can trust that 5%. And there's two reasons that I say that. First, there has been a lifetime of miseducation in schools. And then we get to law school, and the damage is even compounded. Before law school, we are trained to think about individualism. Our priority is not on a collective struggle because of the way we are educated or miseducated, I should say. We are all pupils in this country of this do-me school of thought. And then we enter legal academies. And then the damage is compounded. You see, law schools were designed to meet a need of industrial America. And so when law schools were created, the formal law school I speak of, there was emphasis being placed at that time on how do we protect capitalism. And that is why when you're in law school, you see that first year curriculum. What are you studying? Property. Because what do you need in an industrial America? Property. And you're studying contracts, because what do you need in that industrial America? You're studying torts. And that first year curriculum really has not changed since we started organized law schools. And so in my book, Diversity of the Jury Box, I say to you that the courses we study in law school endure as a reflection of tools that maintain imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy. The course offerings is not the only problem, however. The training is also problematic. Law schools teach law as if it has no color. Textbooks fail to tell us the landmark case, Mapp versus Ohio, involves a black woman who was brutalized because she stood with her back up. And she looked this white officer in the face and she dared to assert her constitutional rights. The books don't celebrate the fact that Dole Mapp fought the state and won. The books fail to tell us that NWA is amongst the ranks of our successful First Amendment defenders in this country. They were criminalized for telling the truth about traveling while black, and breathing while black, and driving while black. Before, law schools would tell us that U.S. v. Cruikshank involves mass-scale lynching of black men in Louisiana for exercising their right to vote. It was simply draft an opinion and remove all of the truth from the facts, and then take the case completely out of law books. The books failed to teach us anything about Terry versus Ohio involving a black man. The court says that Terry was suspicious because he was simply looking in the window of a store. This opinion legalizes racial profiling of black men or people of color, but instead of telling us that, law schools fools us into believing that good police work was at issue. Law schools also use an approach to reasoning that is harmful. Traditional legal rhetoric denies that there are different ways of thinking. It marginalizes the voice of others because it is founded on an ancient and deeply rooted substrate that has long embraced racism, sexism, economic, and other forms of inequality. Law students in this country, it is marginalizing all of us who do not identify as white when we study in these schools. So if lawyers are trained in subjects that reinforce racism and capitalism, and they are taught to reason in ways that favor both, then we become harmful to the very systems that run counter to this. So am I suggesting somehow that you forego law school? Not at all. That is not my point. Black lawyers must lead in this struggle not because of legal training, but despite it. So how do we do that? We must become authors of books that will train the next generation of freedom fighters. We must organize teach-ins for those freedom fighters. Where innovations can be introduced and explored, it is our duty to mentor those young lawyers and indoctrinate them with strategies for effective social change. In this fight for freedom, black lawyers must also be our social engineer. They must be our democratic compass. And there's a reason why in Reconstruction it was cloaked somehow, this idea that we would emancipate people and enunciate them in somehow from this bondage of being property into citizenship. We did that for a reason. The reason that we adopted the 14th Amendment and cloaked people of color with citizenship was because we wanted them to have the protections of the United States Constitution. We did that because we wanted them to actually be a part of the democracy. So if it is true that Reconstruction ended in 1877, this would mean black folks are now experiencing citizenship. It would mean that we are benefiting from the Constitution, and it would also mean that we are now living in this democracy. It also means now that it is the duty of every black lawyer in this room and in this country to declare that an absolute lie. In 2025, blacks are not allowed onto juries in their proper numbers. They are routinely subject to Brady violations and wrongful convictions. Black district attorneys and other black elected officials are being neutered and rendered powerless, despite the fact that the people have elected them. Days ago, Trump attempted an assault now again on the 14th Amendment when he signed this birthright citizenship executive order. That order exceeds the president's authority. It runs afoul of the Constitution and federal statutes. It also suggests to us, black people, that we are one executive order away from the same. Let's not forget it was that very same amendment that is under attack that was the one used to free us, the one used to transform us from property to citizens. So if we have one man now that can distort a whole constitutional amendment against one group, we must spell the threat that awaits. Black lawyers, you are the trigger that vulnerable people pull at times like this, when civil liberties and constitutional protections are sidestepped. It is the black lawyer's role in this fight for freedom to innovate and embrace new pathways to social progress. During the lynching era, this far back we had black lawyers doing this very thing. I speak of a lawyer named Louis A. Martinet, who formed a group called the Citizens Committee. That group was committed to one thing, and it was undoing segregation. Yes, Martinet was a lawyer, but he did not rely exclusively on courts. The Citizens Committee used a three-pronged approach to social change. They believed in public education, they believed in litigation, and they believed in direct action. And I have built a successful career just doing that one thing, adopting the strategy that worked so successfully back during the lynching era for the Citizens Committee in Louis A. Martinet, and I memorialized these things in my latest book called The Summons. And then there is the work of the NAACP, the Black Panther Party, and many other activists who understood that they could never see justice in this country. So they learned to navigate the systems through the United Nations, and they fought very successfully through the grievance process at the UN. Lastly, it is the Black lawyer's role in the fight for freedom to act as an interpreter for the people. A time ago, individuals were the culprit, and that is no longer the case. Our fight now is against systemic oppression and not single individual oppressors. By systemic, I mean a system of intersecting, system of overlapping and codependent racist institutions, policies, practices, ideas, and behaviors that give an unjust amount of resources, rights, and power to white people while denying them to people of color. The schemes are not always easy, and it is our role to learn how to decode. For example, in Commonwealth versus Dobson, a 2024 Fourth Amendment case, the arresting officer testifies in court that he frisked a passenger in a stopped vehicle for weapons simply because of the defendant's presence in what the officer described as a high crime area. All of the lower courts saw nothing wrong with this. It was only one Pennsylvania Supreme Court justice who decided to write a dissent. And he says, I quote, "The consequences of the lower court's decision is severe. The ruling allows police officers to conclude that any nighttime stop in a high crime area for a traffic violation allows the officer to seize and frisk every occupant of the vehicle. So that would mean, according to this justice, a couple who drives from a dinner date, they risk being stopped and frisked if that driver accidentally rolls through a stop sign. The justice goes on in the dissent to say carpoolers who are innocently on the way home from their evening shift who pass through a high crime area can be frisked if the driver forgets simply to turn on the turn signal. The Supreme Court justice says, and I quote, "People who live in poor areas are riddled with crime. They do not deserve fewer constitutional rights than people who have means. The community depends on us to do the lights. We must have the skills to decode for the community. They also look to us for responses to systemic racism. I'm an advocate for transitional justice as a way of transitioning failing systems to systems that no longer hold. What innovations do you have to contribute to this struggle?" You'll remember me mentioning the popular song Imagine earlier, the one that was so popular in the 70s. Well, the Heritage Foundation might have needed Lennon to teach them a few things about Imagine, but not the Supreme Southwest region of the National Black Lawsuiters Association. See, we know that every legal game that has ever happened in this country started with someone having an imagination. We know this because we have the blood of the 13-year-old black girl who died in transport after being taken from Africa during chattel slavery. We have her blood pumping through our veins. While she was in transport, she was infected with gonorrhea. Her body became weak. In this state, the captain said to this 13-year-old black girl, "Get up and dance." She refused. And when she refused, she was suspended in the air. She was beaten unmercifully. Her hands became swollen. Her legs became disfigured. Then convulsions started. She languished